The veterinarian's face drained of all color as she stepped back from the examination table, her hands trembling. "Sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "you need to stay very calm right now. This is not a puppy." Mark Thompson stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribcage. The small, fluffy creature he'd been cuddling for the past 3 weeks sat innocently on the stainless steel table, its amber eyes gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "What do you mean it's not a puppy?" he managed to choke out. The vet reached for the phone with shaking hands, her eyes never leaving the animal. "I'm calling wildlife control right now. But before we dive into this unbelievable story, make sure you hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible rescue stories. Also, drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. Now, let's rewind 3 weeks to understand how Mark Thompson ended up in the most terrifying situation of his life. It was a cold Tuesday morning in late October when Mark decided to take his usual route through Pinewood Forest on his way to work. Mark was a 34-year-old construction supervisor living in rural Montana, a man who'd always had a soft spot for animals. His golden retriever, Bailey, had passed away 6 months earlier, leaving an emptiness in his home that nothing seemed to fill. The morning mist clung to the trees as Mark's truck rumbled along the dirt path cutting through the forest. He'd taken this shortcut for years, enjoying the peaceful solitude before facing another chaotic day at the construction site. But this morning was different. As his headlights swept across the road ahead, Mark spotted something small and dark huddled near the edge of the tree line. He slowed down, squinting through the windshield. At first, he thought it might be a branch or a pile of leaves, but then it moved. Mark pulled over immediately and grabbed his flashlight from the glove compartment. The November air bit at his face as he stepped out of the truck. He approached cautiously, the beam of light bouncing through the early morning darkness. There, shivering violently against the base of a massive pine tree, was what appeared to be a tiny puppy. Its fur was matted and muddy, and it couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. The poor thing was whimpering softly, barely able to lift its head. "Oh, you poor little guy," Mark murmured, his heart immediately melting. Always been a sucker for animals in distress. He knelt down slowly, extending his hand so the puppy could smell him. The creature flinched initially, but didn't try to run away. It was too weak, too cold. Mark could see its tiny body trembling uncontrollably. "It's okay, buddy. I've got you," Mark whispered soothingly. He carefully scooped the puppy into his arms, immediately noticing how surprisingly light it was. The animal fit perfectly in his cupped hands. As Mark stood up, cradling the shivering bundle against his chest, he tried to warm it with his body heat. The puppy made a strange, soft chittering sound, almost like a bird's call mixed with a whimper. Mark assumed it was just distress from being abandoned in the cold. He looked around the forest, searching for any sign of other puppies or mother dog. Nothing. Just endless trees and the morning mist. Who would abandon such a young animal out here in the middle of nowhere? It was miles from the nearest town. Mark felt a surge of anger at whoever had done this. But his immediate concern was getting this little one warm and fed. He hurried back to his truck, carefully placing the puppy on the passenger seat and wrapping it in an old work jacket he kept behind the seats. The creature burrowed into the fabric immediately, seeking warmth. Mark cranked up the heat in the truck and decided work could wait. This puppy needed help now. As he drove toward town, Mark kept glancing over at his tiny passenger. In the growing daylight, he could see the puppy more clearly. Its fur was an unusual grayish-brown color, with lighter patches around what he assumed would grow into a beautiful coat. The ears were disproportionately large for its head, and its snout seemed a bit more pointed than most puppies he'd seen. But Mark chalked that up to mixed breeding. "You're going to be okay," Mark said softly. "I'll get you cleaned up, fed, and we'll figure out what to do with you." The puppy, if that's what it really was, opened its eyes briefly. Mark's breath caught. Those eyes were striking, a brilliant amber color that seemed to glow in the dashboard lights. He'd never seen eyes quite that color on a dog before. They were beautiful, almost hypnotic. Mark pulled into the parking lot of the only pet store in town that opened early. Inside, He quickly grabbed supplies: puppy formula, bottles, soft blankets, a small carrier, and some basic grooming supplies. The clerk, a young woman named Sarah, cooed over the puppy when Mark brought it in. "Oh my goodness, what a unique-looking little guy," she exclaimed. "What breed is he?" "I'm not sure," Mark admitted. "I found him abandoned in the forest this morning. I think he might be a mixed breed. Maybe some husky or wolf dog mix. Those eyes are something else, aren't they?" Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "They're gorgeous. He's lucky you found him. Make sure you get him to a vet soon for a checkup." "Definitely," Mark agreed, though he had no intention of giving the puppy up. Already, he felt a connection forming. This little creature needed him, and he needed something to care for again. Back home, Mark set up a cozy space in his living room with the new supplies. He gently cleaned the puppy with warm water, carefully working out the mats and dirt from its fur. The animal tolerated the bath surprisingly well, though it made those strange, chittering sounds again whenever Mark touched certain areas. After drying it off, Mark tried feeding it with the puppy formula. The creature was ravenous, drinking eagerly from the bottle. Mark smiled, feeling that familiar warmth of caring for something helpless and innocent. "I think I'll call you Scout," Mark decided, running a gentle finger over the puppy's head, "because I found you out scouting in the forest." Scout's amber eyes locked onto Mark's face, and for just a moment, something flickered in that gaze, something wild, something ancient, something that should have warned Mark that nothing about this situation was what it seemed. But Mark, exhausted from the emotional morning and already bonding with his new companion, missed all the signs. He had no idea that he'd just brought something dangerous into his home, something that shouldn't be domesticated, something that, in a few short weeks, would have veterinarians calling the authorities and experts descending on his quiet Montana town. The rescue that seemed like a blessing was about to become Mark Thompson's most terrifying experience. The first week with Scout passed in a blur of sleepless nights and constant feeding schedules. Mark had taken a few days off work to focus on nursing his new companion back to health, and the transformation was remarkable. Scout gained weight rapidly, its coat became shinier, and its energy level skyrocketed. But as Scout grew stronger, Mark began noticing things that didn't quite add up. On the third night, Mark was awakened by strange sounds coming from the living room. It was around 2 a.m., and the house was dark except for the moonlight streaming through the windows. The sounds were unlike anything he'd heard from a puppy before. Not barking or whining, but a series of high-pitched yips and chirps that echoed through the silent house. Mark stumbled out of bed and made his way downstairs. What he saw made him pause in the doorway. Scout was fully awake, standing in the middle of the living room floor in a hunting posture Mark had only seen in wildlife documentaries. The puppy's body was low to the ground, its oversized ears pricked forward with intense focus, and those amber eyes were fixed on something Mark couldn't see. Scout's head moved in sharp, quick jerks, tracking something invisible across the room. "Scout!" Mark called softly. The puppy's head snapped toward him with unnatural speed, and for just a second, Mark saw something in those eyes that made his blood run cold. It wasn't the sweet, innocent look of a domesticated dog. It was the predatory gaze of a wild hunter. Then, just as quickly, the moment passed. Scout's tail began wagging, and it bounded over to Mark with typical puppy enthusiasm, jumping at his legs and making happy sounds. Mark laughed, shaking off the eerie feeling. "You're just a weird little guy, aren't you?" he said, scooping Scout up. "Probably just had a dream or something." But that wouldn't be the last strange incident. By the second week, Scout had more than doubled in size. Mark was impressed by how quickly the puppy was growing, though it seemed unusually fast even for a large breed. Scout's legs were becoming disproportionately long, and its paws seemed enormous compared to its body. The eating habits were another puzzle. Mark had transitioned Scout to soft puppy food, but Scout showed an overwhelming preference for raw meat. Whenever Mark prepared chicken for dinner, Scout would go absolutely wild, not with normal puppy excitement, but with an almost frantic intensity that bordered on aggressive. One evening, Mark made the mistake of leaving a package of raw ground beef on the counter while he answered his phone. When he returned less than 2 minutes later, Scout had somehow jumped onto the counter, an impressive feat for such a young animal, and had torn through the packaging. The puppy was devouring the raw meat with a ferocity that startled Mark. "Scout! No!" Mark rushed over, but Scout growled at him. Actually growled. A deep, guttural sound that no puppy should be able to make. The fur along Scout's spine stood up, and those amber eyes flashed with warning. Mark froze, genuinely frightened for the first time. This wasn't puppy possessiveness over food. This was something primal, something dangerous. "Scout!" Mark said firmly, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "Drop it." For several tense seconds, Scout stared at him, meat hanging from its jaws, muscles tensed as if preparing to defend its kill. Then, gradually, the puppy relaxed. The growling stopped, the fur flattened, and Scout dropped the meat, looking almost confused by its own behavior. Mark carefully cleaned up the mess, his hands shaking slightly. He told himself it was normal puppy behavior, that Scout was just food aggressive from being starved in the forest. But deep down, a voice was beginning to whisper that something was very wrong. The physical changes continued rapidly. By the end of the second week, Scout's ears had grown even larger and more pointed. The snout was definitely longer than any puppy's Mark had ever seen. The tail was thick and bushy, and the way Scout moved was becoming less dog-like and more something else. Scout's agility was extraordinary. The puppy could leap incredible heights, landing with perfect balance. It could run at speeds that seemed impossible for its size. And the climbing. Mark came home one day to find Scout perched on top of his 6-foot bookshelf, having somehow scaled the furniture to get there. "That's not normal," Mark muttered, staring up at Scout, who sat calmly surveying the room from its high perch like a cat, or like a wolf watching over its territory. The night behaviors became more pronounced. Scout was almost completely nocturnal now, sleeping most of the day and becoming active after sunset. Mark would wake to find Scout sitting perfectly still at the window, those glowing amber eyes fixed on the darkness outside, watching, waiting, as if listening to sounds Mark couldn't hear. One night, Mark decided to watch Scout more carefully. He pretended to go to bed, but instead crept back downstairs and observed from the darkened hallway. What he witnessed made his mouth go dry. Scout was practicing hunting behaviors. The puppy would stalk shadows, pounce with lightning speed, and then shake its head violently, as if breaking the neck of prey. The movements were too practiced, too instinctual, too perfect. These weren't learned behaviors from mother dog. These were hardwired hunting techniques. And then there were the vocalizations. Scout rarely barked like a normal dog. Instead, it made a range of sounds Mark had never heard from any domestic animal. Yips, howls, chirps, and that strange chittering sound. Sometimes, late at night, Scout would point its nose toward the ceiling and let out a long, haunting howl that raised every hair on Mark's neck. His neighbors started commenting too. Mrs. Henderson from next door stopped Mark one morning as he was leaving for work. "Mark, dear, I don't mean to pry, but what kind of dog did you say you rescued?" She looked nervous, clutching her purse. "I'm not entirely sure," Mark admitted. "Probably some kind of mixed breed." "What?" Mrs. Henderson glanced around, as if afraid someone might overhear. "It's just the sounds at night. They don't sound like any dog I've ever heard. My husband thought there might be wolves in the area. We were worried." "Oh no, it's just Scout." Mark laughed, trying to sound casual. "He's just a puppy with a unique voice." But Mrs. Henderson didn't look convinced. "If you say so, dear. Just be careful, okay?" As she walked away, Mark felt that cold knot of worry in his stomach tighten. Be careful of what? His own puppy? That afternoon, Mark decided to do some research. He sat at his computer and started searching for information about different dog breeds, trying to find something that matched Scout's appearance and behaviors. Wolf-dog hybrids came up frequently. Mark studied pictures and descriptions, and while there were some similarities, something still didn't fit. Scout's ears were too large, the eyes too intensely amber, the facial structure too narrow. He expanded his search to wild canines, coyotes, foxes, jackals. His heart began to race as he clicked through images. Some of the fox species, particularly the maned wolf and certain wild dogs, had features that reminded him of Scout. But it couldn't be. Those were wild animals, not pets. They didn't just appear in Montana forests, as helpless puppies. Or did they? Mark's hands hovered over the keyboard as a terrifying thought occurred to him. What if Scout wasn't a puppy at all? What if he'd rescued something that was never meant to be domesticated? What if, despite his best intentions and genuine love for this creature, he was raising something dangerous? He looked over at Scout, who was curled up on the couch, looking for all the world like an innocent puppy taking an afternoon nap. Those big amber eyes opened and met his gaze, and Scout's tail thumped happily against the cushions. Mark smiled despite his worries. "I'm probably just being paranoid," he told himself. "You're just special, aren't you, Scout?" But that night, everything would change. That night, Mark would witness something that would finally convince him that he needed professional help. That night, he would realize that the creature sleeping in his home was something far more extraordinary and far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. And the clock was ticking, because whatever Scout really was, it was growing fast. And with each passing day, it was becoming less puppy and more predator. It happened on a Thursday night, exactly 3 weeks after Mark had found Scout in the forest. Mark had invited his friend Jake over for dinner and to meet his new puppy. Jake was a fellow construction worker, a practical, no-nonsense guy who'd known Mark for years. Mark thought having someone else meet Scout might help ease his growing concerns. Maybe Jake would confirm that he was just overthinking things, that Scout was just an unusual but harmless mixed breed. Jake arrived around 7, carrying a 6-pack of beer and wearing his typical good-natured grin. "All right, where's this mysterious puppy I've been hearing about?" he called out as Mark opened the door. "He's around here somewhere," Mark replied, stepping aside to let Jake in. "Scout, come here, boy." Scout emerged from the kitchen, and Mark immediately noticed something different. The puppy's body language was tense, wary. Its ears were pinned back, and it was moving in a low, stalking posture that Mark had seen before but never directed at a person. "Whoa," Jake said, stopping in his tracks. "That's your puppy?" Scout had frozen in place, eyes locked on Jake with unblinking intensity. A low rumble started deep in the puppy's chest. Not quite a growl, but definitely not friendly. "Scout, it's okay," Mark said quickly, moving between them. "Jake's a friend." But Scout wasn't responding to Mark's reassurances. If anything, the puppy's posture became more aggressive. The fur along its spine stood straight up, making Scout look twice its size. Those amber eyes had taken on that wild, predatory look that Mark had been seeing more frequently. Jake slowly raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Hey there, little guy. I'm not going to hurt you." That's when Scout lunged. The puppy moved with shocking speed, covering the distance in a single powerful leap. Its jaws were open, teeth bared, aiming straight for Jake's leg. Mark reacted on pure instinct, diving forward and catching Scout midair, wrapping his arms around the snarling, twisting animal. "Jesus Christ!" Jake stumbled backward, his face pale. "Mark, what the hell?" Scout was fighting Mark with a strength that seemed impossible for its size. The puppy writhed and snapped, making those terrifying sounds. Not barks, but something between a shriek and a snarl that made both men's blood run cold. Mark struggled to maintain his grip, feeling Scout's claws raking across his arms. "Jake, the bathroom. Open the door," Mark shouted, wrestling Scout down the hallway. Jake rushed ahead and threw open the bathroom door. Mark practically threw Scout inside and slammed the door shut, leaning against it as the puppy hurled itself against the other side, scratching and screaming with rage. Both men stood in the hallway, breathing hard, staring at each other in shock. "What the hell is that thing?" Jake gasped, looking at the bathroom door as it shuddered under Scout's assault. "That is not a puppy, man." Mark's arms were bleeding from multiple scratches. His shirt was torn. His hands were shaking. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. I thought it was just a puppy." From inside the bathroom, Scout's sounds gradually changed from aggressive to something that sounded almost like crying. High-pitched, mournful sounds that broke Mark's heart even as fear coursed through his veins. "You need to call animal control," Jake said firmly, backing toward the front door. "Right now? That thing tried to attack me. What if it had been a kid? Mark, you could get sued. Hell, that thing could seriously hurt someone." I know. Mark ran his hands through his hair, trying to think clearly. But he's never done anything like that before. Maybe he was just scared. You're a stranger, and... Mark. Jake's voice was serious, almost angry. Listen to yourself. You're making excuses for an animal that just tried to bite me. That's not normal puppy behavior. That's predator behavior. You need to face facts here. After Jake left, cutting the evening short and making Mark promise to do something about Scout, Mark stood alone in his hallway, listening to the sounds coming from the bathroom. Scout had quieted down to soft whimpers and occasional scratches at the door. Mark's mind was racing. He thought about the past 3 weeks, all the strange behaviors, the unusual physical features, the increasingly aggressive episodes. He thought about Mrs. Henderson's worried face, about how quickly Scout was growing, about those amber eyes that sometimes looked so alien. He pulled out his phone and started searching again, but this time with different keywords: wild animal rescue, exotic pet identification, dangerous canines. The results made his stomach drop. After an hour of increasingly frantic research, Mark finally made a decision. Tomorrow morning, first thing, he would take Scout to see Dr. Patricia Chun, the most experienced veterinarian in the county. She'd worked with wildlife before moving to private practice. If anyone could tell him what Scout really was, it would be her. Mark slowly opened the bathroom door, ready to slam it shut again if necessary. Scout was huddled in the corner, looking small and pitiful again. The aggression had completely vanished. When Scout saw Mark, the puppy's tail gave a hesitant wag. "Come here," Mark said softly, kneeling down. Scout approached cautiously, then pressed against Mark's chest, making those sad, whimpering sounds. Mark wrapped his arms around the animal, feeling its rapid heartbeat against his hands. "What are you?" Mark whispered. "What did I bring into my home?" That night, Mark barely slept. He'd set up a baby gate to keep Scout confined to the kitchen, not entirely trusting the animal anymore. Every sound made him jerk awake, wondering if Scout was trying to escape, wondering if he'd wake up to find those amber eyes staring at him in the darkness. At dawn, Mark was already dressed and ready. Scout seemed to sense something was different. The puppy was unusually calm, watching Mark with an intelligence that seemed far too advanced for a young animal. "We're going to see a doctor," Mark told Scout as he carefully placed the animal in a carrier. "She's going to help us figure out what you are. Everything's going to be okay." But as Mark drove toward Dr. Chen's veterinary clinic, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, he knew deep down that nothing was going to be okay. Whatever Scout was, it was clear that keeping this creature was no longer safe. The thought broke his heart, but after last night, he couldn't deny reality anymore. He bonded with Scout. He loved this strange, wild creature. But love wasn't enough when the creature you loved might be dangerous. Dr. Chen's clinic was a modern building on the outskirts of town. Mark had called ahead, explaining that he had an urgent situation with a rescued animal and unusual behavior. The receptionist had squeezed him in for the first appointment of the day. As Mark carried Scout's carrier through the front door, the receptionist looked up with a professional smile that faltered when she saw the animal inside. "Oh," she said quietly, "you can go right back. Dr. Chun is waiting in exam room, too." The hallway seemed impossibly long. Scout was making those chittering sounds again, pressed against the back of the carrier. Mark could feel his heart hammering as he pushed open the exam room door. Dr. Patricia Chun was a woman in her mid-50s with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail. She looked up from her tablet and smiled at Mark. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson. I understand you have an unusual rescue case." "That's putting it mildly," Mark said, setting the carrier on the examination table. "I found him 3 weeks ago in the forest. I thought he was a puppy, but now I'm not so sure." Dr. Chen's expression was still pleasant and professional as she approached the carrier. "Well, let's take a look and see what we're." She stopped mid-sentence as she peered through the carrier door. Her face went completely still. The color slowly drained from her cheeks. Her hand, reaching for the carrier latch, began to tremble. "Dr. Chun," Mark asked nervously, "what is it? What's wrong?" The veterinarian took a slow step backward, her eyes never leaving the carrier. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Mr. Thompson, I need you to very carefully step away from that carrier." "What? Why? What is he?" Dr. Chun moved to her desk with deliberate, controlled movements, her hand reaching for the phone. I'm calling wildlife control, and possibly the police. Police? Mark's voice cracked. Why would you call the police? Dr. Chun turned to face him, and Mark saw something in her eyes he'd never expected to see from the calm, professional veterinarian. Fear. Pure, genuine fear. Mr. Thompson, she said, her hand shaking as she picked up the phone. You didn't rescue a puppy. What you have in that carrier is one of the most dangerous predators in North America. And if what I think I'm looking at is correct, you're in violation of at least a dozen wildlife protection laws, whether you knew it or not. Mark felt the room tilt. What are you saying? What is Scout? Dr. Chun dialed a number, her eyes flickering between Mark and the carrier. I'm saying, Mr. Thompson, that you've been living with a wild animal that, if I'm correct, hasn't been seen in this region for over 50 years. And as it matures, it becomes increasingly aggressive, increasingly territorial, and increasingly deadly. The phone rang once before someone picked up. Mark heard Dr. Chin's voice as if from very far away. Yes, this is Dr. Patricia Chun at Pinewood Veterinary Clinic. I need you to send a wildlife team immediately. I have a situation here that requires urgent attention. It involves she paused, staring at Scout through the carrier, what I believe is a juvenile red wolf, possibly endangered, and a civilian has been housing it for 3 weeks. Red wolf. The words echoed in Mark's mind. Scout was a red wolf, not a puppy, not a dog, a wolf, one of the most elusive, dangerous predators in the country. And he'd been cuddling it, sleeping in the same house with it, loving it. Oh my God, Mark breathed, sinking into the nearest chair. Oh my God, what have I done? The next 45 minutes passed in a blur of controlled chaos. Dr. Chin kept Mark and Scout in the examination room, but she stood by the door, clearly ready to bolt if Scout showed any signs of aggression. She explained, in a voice that shook despite her professional training, exactly what they were dealing with. Red wolves were declared extinct in the wild in 1980, Dr. Chin said, her eyes never leaving the carrier. There's been a reintroduction program, but they're only supposed to be in specific areas in North Carolina and Tennessee. Finding one here in Montana it's impossible. It shouldn't be happening. But if they're endangered, isn't this good news? Mark asked desperately, trying to find some silver lining. I found one. I've been taking care of it. Mr. Thompson, Dr. Chin interrupted gently. I understand you had good intentions, but red wolves are not dogs. They can't be domesticated. As Scout matures, the aggression will increase. The territorial behavior will become overwhelming. And you, no matter how much you bonded, will eventually be seen as a threat or as prey. The words hit Mark like physical blows. Prey. The cute, fluffy creature he'd rescued could one day see him as prey. There's also the legal issue, Dr. Chin continued. Keeping an endangered species without proper permits and facilities is a federal crime. You could face serious fines, possibly even jail time. I didn't know, Mark protested. I thought I was saving a puppy. I believe you, Dr. Chin said, her voice softening. But that doesn't change what Scout is, or what needs to happen next. Mark looked at the carrier, where Scout had gone eerily quiet. Those amber eyes were visible through the door grate, watching, always watching. What will happen to him? Before Dr. Chin could answer, they heard vehicles pulling up outside. Through the window, Mark could see 3 trucks, one marked Montana Wildlife Services, another with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the third from State Police. They're here, Dr. Chin said, moving toward the door. Please, Mr. Thompson, let them handle this. These people are trained professionals. The door opened, and a team of 6 people entered. Wildlife officers in specialized gear, carrying equipment Mark recognized from nature documentaries. Catch poles, protective gloves, secure transport crates, and even tranquilizer guns. Leading them was a tall woman with weathered features and sharp, intelligent eyes. She introduced herself as Director Sarah Martinez from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Her gaze immediately locked onto the carrier on the examination table. Dr. Chun, you were right to call us, Director Martinez said, approaching the carrier slowly. If this is what you think it is, we have a major situation. She knelt beside the table, peering through the carrier door. Mark watched her face transform from professional curiosity to absolute astonishment. "My God," she whispered. "It really is a red wolf pup. Maybe 3 to 4 months old now. How is this possible?" "That's what I'd like to know," came a gruff voice from the doorway. A state police officer entered, notepad in hand. "Mr. Thompson, is it? I need to ask you some questions about where and when you found this animal." For the next 20 minutes, Mark recounted the entire story. Finding Scout in the forest, assuming it was an abandoned puppy, the 3 weeks of increasingly strange behavior, last night's attack on Jake, and finally, this morning's decision to bring Scout to a veterinarian. Director Martinez listened intently, occasionally asking for specific details about the location where Mark had found Scout. She was particularly interested in the exact area of Pinewood Forest. "That region is over 2,000 miles from any known red wolf population," she said, pulling up maps on her tablet. "There's no way a pup that young could have traveled that distance." Which means what?" Mark asked, hope flickering in his chest. Maybe there was an explanation that would make this less terrible. "Which means there might be a breeding population we didn't know about," Director Martinez said, excitement and concern mixing in her voice. "Or someone illegally transported wolves into this area, and they escaped. Either way, this is huge." One of the wildlife officers, a young man named Chris, had been carefully examining Scout through the carrier during this conversation. "Director Martinez, you need to see this." Everyone crowded around as Chris pointed to specific features. "Look at the ear size relative to the skull, the snout length, the paw structure. And these markings here," he indicated the coloring pattern on Scout's fur. "This isn't just any red wolf. Based on these characteristics, this could be from one of the original bloodlines. The genetic diversity we've been trying to preserve." "You're saying this wolf is genetically valuable?" Mark asked, not entirely understanding, but sensing this was important. "Potentially incredibly valuable," Director Martinez confirmed. "The captive breeding program has been struggling with genetic bottlenecks. If Scout represents a previously unknown population with diverse genetics," she shook her head in amazement, "this could be exactly what the recovery program needs." Despite the circumstances, Mark felt a strange sense of pride. Scout wasn't just any rescued animal. Scout was potentially crucial to saving an entire species. But Director Martinez's next words brought him crashing back to reality. "Mr. Thompson, I need to be very clear with you. Scout cannot stay with you. We'll be transporting him today to a specialized facility that handles endangered species. He'll be quarantined, examined, and eventually integrated into the breeding program." "Can I visit him?" Mark asked, his voice breaking. "Can I see him again?" The director's expression softened. "I'm sorry. It's better for Scout if we make a clean break. Continuing contact with you would only confuse him and make the transition harder. He needs to be with his own kind, learning wolf behaviors, not bonding further with humans." Mark felt tears stinging his eyes. "I understand. I want what's best for him." "I know you do," Director Martinez said kindly. "And what you did, calling for help when you realized something was wrong, that was the right thing. Many people would have kept trying to make it work, and someone could have been seriously hurt." The team began preparing for Scout's transport. They set up a larger, more secure crate and carefully transferred Scout from Mark's carrier. Throughout the process, Scout remained surprisingly calm. Those amber eyes watching everything with intelligence that seemed to understand this was a turning point. When Scout was finally secured in the transport crate, Mark asked if he could say goodbye. Director Martinez hesitated, then nodded. Quickly, Mark knelt beside the crate, looking at Scout one last time. The wolf pup, not puppy, he reminded himself, wolf pup, stare back at him. For just a moment, Scout's tail wagged slightly, and Mark could have sworn he saw recognition in those wild eyes. "I'm sorry, Scout," Mark whispered. "I'm sorry I can't give you what you need. But you're going to be okay. You're going to be with your own kind. You're going to help save your species." His voice cracked. "And I'll never forget you." Scout made one of those soft chittering sounds, pressing against the crate door as if trying to get closer to Mark one last time. Then the wildlife team was lifting the crate, carrying Scout toward the waiting trucks. Mark stood frozen, watching through the clinic window as they loaded Scout into the specialized vehicle. He watched until the trucks pulled away, carrying Scout out of his life forever. The examination room felt impossibly empty. The days following Scout's departure were some of the hardest of Mark's life. The investigation into how a red wolf pup ended up in Montana intensified. Director Martinez called Mark several times, updating him on the search of Pinewood Forest. A team of wildlife experts combed the area where Mark had found Scout, looking for signs of other wolves, dens, or evidence of illegal wildlife trafficking. On the fourth day after Scout's capture, Director Martinez called with news. "Mr. Thompson, I thought you'd want to know what we found." Mark gripped the phone tightly. "Did you find more wolves?" "No," Martinez said, and Mark could hear the mixture of disappointment and confusion in her voice. "We found something else. Evidence of a private vehicle, tire tracks leading to the exact area where you found Scout. And," she paused, "we found a damaged transport crate partially buried about 50 yards from where Scout was." "What does that mean?" Mark asked. "It means Scout was likely being transported illegally, probably purchased on the black market from someone connected to the breeding program. We're investigating potential corruption within the facilities. The vehicle broke down or had an accident, and somehow Scout escaped. The traffickers must have panicked and left the area. So Scout wasn't naturally occurring here," Mark said quietly. "He was stolen. Most likely. But here's the incredible part, Mr. Thompson. When we got Scout to the facility and ran genetic tests, we discovered he's even more valuable than we initially thought. His bloodline includes genetic markers from wolves we thought were lost. Whoever stole him might have inadvertently saved crucial genetic diversity for the species by leading us to discover Scout." Despite everything, Mark felt a smile tugging at his lips. "So he really is special. Extremely special," Martinez confirmed. "And I want you to know, he's doing well. He's been introduced to other wolves his age in a controlled environment, and he's adapting quickly. He's remembering how to be a wolf. That's good," Mark said, even as his heart ached. "That's really good." Martinez's voice softened. "Mr. Thompson, about the legal situation. Given the circumstances, that you had no knowledge of what Scout was, that you provided excellent care, and that you immediately sought professional help when you suspected something was wrong, the federal prosecutor has decided not to press charges. You're being classified as a good Samaritan who rescued an endangered animal, not as a wildlife trafficker." Relief flooded through Mark. "Thank you. Thank you for telling me that. You did the right thing," Martinez said. "Not just calling Dr. Chun, but taking care of Scout those 3 weeks. Without your intervention, he likely wouldn't have survived. You saved his life, even if not in the way you originally thought." After the call ended, Mark sat in his silent house, processing everything. He looked at the corner where Scout's bed had been, at the toys he still hadn't put away, at the scratches on the hardwood floor from those oversized wolf paws. The doorbell rang, breaking his reverie. Mark opened it to find Jake standing there, looking awkward and holding a 6-pack of beer. "Hey, man," Jake said. "I heard the news about Scout being a wolf and everything. I wanted to check on you." Mark stepped aside to let him in. "I'm okay, I think. Still processing." They sat in the living room, and Mark told Jake everything that had happened. When he finished, Jake shook his head in amazement. "That's insane, dude. You were living with an actual wolf for 3 weeks, and you survived. He was just a pup," Mark said defensively, "and he never actually hurt me. Even when he went after you, it was instinct, not malice." "Still," Jake said, "you've got to admit, it's a crazy story. You literally rescued one of the rarest animals in North America, thinking it was a stray puppy." Mark laughed despite himself. "When you put it that way, yeah, it does sound pretty unbelievable." Over the following weeks, Mark found himself becoming something of a local celebrity. The story of the construction worker who accidentally rescued an endangered wolf pup made regional news, then national news. Reporters called constantly. Environmental organizations wanted to interview him. He even got a letter from the governor thanking him for his inadvertent contribution to wildlife conservation. Mrs. Henderson from next door apologized for being suspicious and brought over a casserole. "I just knew something was unusual," she said. but I never would have guessed it was a wolf. How exciting. 2 months after Scout's capture, Mark received an unexpected package in the mail. Inside was a letter from Director Martinez, along with photos and a certificate. The letter read, "Dear Mr. Thompson, I wanted to update you on Scout's progress. He has successfully integrated with a pack of other young red wolves at our North Carolina facility. He's healthy, thriving, and displaying all the natural behaviors we hope to see. The genetic testing confirmed he carries unique markers that will be crucial for the breeding program. In recognition of your role in Scout's rescue and survival, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is pleased to name you an honorary guardian of the Red Wolf Recovery Program. You'll receive quarterly updates on Scout's progress without specific location information for security reasons. Enclosed are recent photos. I thought you'd like to see how much he's grown. You gave Scout a chance at life, Mr. Thompson. On behalf of the entire conservation community, thank you. Sincerely, Director Sarah Martinez." Mark's hands trembled as he looked at the photos. Scout was huge now, his coat thick and beautiful, standing among other wolves in a natural habitat setting. Those amber eyes still glowed with that special intensity, but now Scout looked complete. Not a confused puppy trying to fit into a human world, but a magnificent wild animal exactly where he belonged. Mark had the best photo framed and hung it on his living room wall. Whenever visitors asked about it, he'd tell them the story of how he thought he'd saved a puppy, but really, he'd been part of saving an entire species. 3 months later, Mark did eventually adopt a dog. An actual dog this time, a golden retriever from the local shelter that he named Bailey Jr. As he played with BJ in his backyard, throwing tennis balls and enjoying normal, predictable dog behavior, Mark would sometimes think about Scout. He imagined Scout running through forests, hunting with his pack, living the wild life he was meant to live. Mark hoped Scout remembered their time together, at least a little. Hoped Scout knew that the strange human who'd fed him bottles and cuddled him had done it out of love. And sometimes, on clear nights, Mark would stand on his porch and listen to the sounds of the Montana wilderness. He never heard wolf howls. Red wolves weren't native to this area, after all, but he'd remember Scout's haunting calls and feel grateful. Grateful for the experience, grateful for the lesson in humility, grateful that Scout was alive and contributing to his species' survival. The veterinarian who'd turned pale at the sight of Scout had been right to be frightened. Mark had been living with a wild predator, making dangerous mistakes born of ignorance and good intentions. But sometimes, miraculously, good intentions and dumb luck combine to create something beautiful. Scout was alive. Scout was thriving. And Mark had played a crucial role in that outcome, however accidentally. As Mark scratched BJ behind the ears and watched the sun set over the same forest where he'd found Scout, he smiled. Some rescue stories don't end the way you expect. Sometimes you set out to save something, only to discover that what you're really saving is far bigger and more important than you ever imagined. And sometimes, the puppy you think you're rescuing turns out to be a wolf. A rare, precious, endangered wolf that will help ensure his species survive for generations to come. That was a pretty good ending, even if it wasn't the one Mark had originally planned. So what do you think about Mark's incredible story? Have you ever rescued an animal that turned out to be something completely unexpected? Share your stories in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this amazing tale of accidental heroism, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable rescue stories. Remember, always consult with wildlife experts if you find an animal you're unsure about. Mark's story had a happy ending, but it could have ended very differently. Respect wildlife, protect endangered species, and know when to call for professional help. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.